Thank you for joining us for this next session of One World, Many Beliefs. We have, in the course of the series so far, we've explored the concept of belief versus the concept of faith. We have talked about Sanatana Dharma, the Hindu tradition. We've heard from the Zoroastrian tradition, we've heard from the Jain tradition last month. We're kind of taking things in more or less chronological order. So the next one in the chronology of faith traditions and faith traditions and worldviews, at least according to how we've tried to figure it out, would be Judaism. So not only do I serve as the chair of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida, which is proud to be partnering with the Winter Park Library for this series, but I just also, by happy coincidence, am a rabbi. So do these kind of presentations all the time. I want to give you this now so I don't forget. At the end of the session, please, if you have the opportunity, to complete these brief evaluations, please feel free to do so, and you can just leave them on the table up there, and we will collect them.
What is your name?
David K.
Okay, Rabbi David K. Okay.
Yes, K-A-Y is the last name, not to be confused with
Danny?
With Danny, or with, there was a Rabbi David K. with an E on the end, who went to jail. That wasn't me.
Okay.
I will say that when that particular, oh, you got one, all right. That particular Rabbi David K. was arrested, my professional organization called me to assure me that they knew it wasn't me.
Oh, good.
Which was reassuring in a way, and then in a way was not so reassuring. Yes, I know it wasn't me. You're talking to me now. I'm not anyway, be that as it may. We're going to talk about Judaism, which self-identifies as Yahadut in Hebrew, or Dat Yisrael, the religion of Israel. And if we had more time, I would go into this whole thing about layers, about when were we known as Hebrews and when were we known as the people of Israel, and when to become known as Jews. But that's a Jewish history thing instead. So it all starts with Abraham, not that Abraham. This Abraham. Now, why this Abraham looks like a European, I'm not quite sure, but that's, if you go looking for drawings of Abraham, that's usually what you get. But Abraham is considered to be the founder of the tradition, both the father in the biological sense and the father in the spiritual sense. He has a rather complicated family tree. You will notice that up at the top there, if you pay kind of close attention, you might notice that there's a lot of marriage of first cousins. And actually, in Abraham's case, he's married to his half-sister. But that was the ancient Near East. It was pretty common. So we've got this whole complicated thing going on here. Abraham's firstborn son is actually named Ishmael by a junior wife named Hagar, who used to be the handmaiden of his senior wife Sarah, and so on. So we can simplify this a little bit, this is sort of the important line as far as Judaism is concerned. Now, Hagar and Ishmael, as far as Islam is concerned, you'll be hearing from Islam in a couple of months, that's the important line of descent from Abraham. But for Judaism, so yes, we were disagreeing that far back. For Judaism, it's Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac, who actually had fraternal twins, but we're more interested in Jacob, who is renamed Israel. And his actually 4 wives, but we're only paying attention to the 2 primary wives, because one gives us sons named Levi and Judah. Judah marries Tamar, or by Tamar actually has a child, whose descendants are King David. And Levi, the son of Jacob and Leah, several generations later gives us Moses and Aaron and Miriam, important figures in Jewish history. With the girl that he actually wanted to marry in the first place, that's a whole other story as well, who is the younger sister of Leah, Jacob has a son named Joseph. And according to the text of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Joseph is given an Egyptian wife named Asnat, and he has 2 boys, Ephraim and Manasseh, who are adopted by his father. So they're adopted by their grandfather. Those are sort of the key players. If you are reading texts about Judaism, if you're reading the text of the Hebrew Bible, those are the names that are going to come up most often. But this is the line that we trace: Abraham and Sarah to Isaac and Rebekah, to Jacob and Rachel and Leah, and those lines give us Judah and Levi, and the important characters later on in the development of Judaism, biblical Judaism. Okay, so if we want to understand a faith tradition, it's very helpful to understand core concepts. In the education field, core concepts are referred to as being generative. That means that if you grasp the core concept, you can sort of reconstruct the important details. Right? When I was getting my master's in education, the example that was given was, I think it was a 1995 graduating class, undergraduate class of Harvard University, was asked one question as sort of a test of core concepts. That one question was, why do the seasons change? Okay, and the significant majority of the students could kind of give you what the reasons were, but they didn't seem to really have grasped the core concept. The core concept, by the way, I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask if anybody can answer it. The core concept is angle of incidence of direct sunlight. Okay, so if you understand that, and you understand that's why, if you understand what that means, then you know not only does the Earth's axis have to be at a tilt in order for it to be winter up here and summer down there, or something over there, but that tilt has to stay the same as the Earth rotates around the sun. Okay? All that you can get from understanding that core concept. 3 core concepts to help us understand most faith traditions, not all faith traditions, but certainly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for sure, any other text-based faith tradition. Those are creation, revelation, and redemption, which kind of parallel the 3 big questions that we have, right? And those being, where do we come from? What are we doing here? And where are we going? Okay? So let's take these one at a time. The first being creation. So how does Judaism understand this core concept? We have to go to our primary text, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And that will be from the very beginning of the very first book, the first chapter of the book of Genesis. But what we have to remember is Judaism is an interpretive tradition. We do not read our sacred text literally, for several reasons. One is, that's really not how you read literature, right? If you're reading Shakespeare, if you're reading, I'll use my own example. I read The Lord of the Rings the first time when I was 16 years old. I reread it every year, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and I have reread it every year. We're about time to do the next rereading. I am now 67 years old, so you figure out how many times I've read Lord of the Rings. Every time I read it, I find something new in it. But if I was going absolutely literal with it, I wouldn't find new meaning every time. Once would have been enough, right? So what we do instead when we encounter our sacred text is we ask the question, what does it come to teach us? Not, is it true, or did it really happen that way? Because that's not really relevant to what the purpose of, at least from the Jewish tradition, what the purpose of sacred text is. We call the 5 books of Moses Torah, which means instruction. We're supposed to learn stuff from it. So this is the question we're always going to ask. So if we see something that looks like a conflict in the narrative, we see something that's unusual, we see something that seems to be a contradiction. We don't say, gee, I wonder what's wrong with it, or what. We say, what does it come to teach us? What are we supposed to learn from that? How are we supposed to extract that? Okay? So what does the creation story come to teach us? Well, as far as Judaism is concerned, it teaches us a couple of things. Perhaps the most important is in Hebrew, Ladonai ha'aretz u'mlo'ah, that the earth and its fullness is Adonai's. We don't own the planet. Everything that's here is not our stuff. We didn't make it. We are temporary residents. We're just passing through. In fact, I always think it's more accurate to say that we are squatters. We're living on somebody else's territory. We're in somebody else's home, right? There are species that have been here for a long time, and we didn't make it anyway, so we don't get to use it however we think we should. The other important lesson, this comes from rabbinic teachings, is no person may say my ancestors were greater than yours. Why? Because according to the creation story, we are all descended from a single breeding pair of human beings, the original human beings, the primordial human beings. Therefore, our ancestors are your ancestors. Everybody has the same ancestors ultimately. My undergraduate degree was in ecology, ethology, and evolution. And so in studying human evolution, evolutionary biologists can trace all of humanity back to an original breeding pair. And because evolutionary biologists have a good sense of humor, guess what they named that breeding pair back a few 100,000 years? Adam and Eve. Yeah, they called them Adam and Eve. So humanity is literally a family. Literally a family. Because we are descended from the single breeding pair. And Genesis 1, the creation story, actually parallels and in some way predicts the theory of evolution. A really cool thing, exercise that you may want to do, is to take those 6 quote-unquote days of creation. We didn't have a 24-hour period of creation, a measure of a day. But take those days of creation, take 1, 2, and 3, and then put 4, 5, and 6 underneath them and compare them. All right? So I'll give you a hint. Day 1, light and darkness. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars, to give light to the day and the night. Okay? So you start from something simpler and more basic, and it develops into something more complex and diverse. That is what happens with natural selection. That's natural history. That's what's happened. Okay? So it actually parallels it in a very fine way. It also puts birds before vertebrate mammals, which until about 30 years ago was not the way we thought life evolved on the planet. But about 30 years ago or so, it was discovered that, yeah, actually, the book of Genesis got that one right. All right, so we need to talk about this story a little bit, right? Because this is the one that we run into all the time. There is no concept of original sin in Judaism. Why is that? Because of the way that the text works. Ours is an interpretive tradition, but we draw the line at allegorical interpretation. So we can interpret the fact that there is this serpent that can talk and apparently has legs. We can interpret that, but we can't say that character is really somebody or something else. That would be allegorical, and Judaism draws a line in interpretation there. Okay, so what does this mean? Here's what happens in the story, and this is the order in which it happens in the story, folks. If you're wondering how Judaism can say there's no original sin when we sort of all kind of know, it's one of those things that we all know in air quotes. How can we say that? First of all, fruit of the knowledge of tree fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is consumed. So now human beings understand that they could actually disobey. All right, which is there's a literary device right there, right? That's a bit of circular logic, because supposedly they disobeyed by doing it, but now they know that they can't. All right. Humans are then expelled from the garden. Then they're told from now on, you don't get everything. You don't live forever because you're being blocked off from the tree of life, right? And you can't just reach out and take any growing fruit that you want to eat which you have been given as food, because you're blocked from the garden. Now you're going to have to work. You're going to have to work, and the man is told you're going to have to labor to produce food, and the woman is told you're going to have to labor to produce children. All right? But look, they're told that after they're already booted out of the garden. So there's no mention or even intimation of reproductive intercourse until after the expulsion from the garden. That's the way it happens in the text. So Judaism says can't be original sin. The eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil can't be the original sin equaling sexual reproduction or sexual behavior, because sexual behavior hasn't happened yet. All right, number 2, revelation. Oops. Revelation for Judaism can be found in these chapters in the book of Exodus. This is the event at Mount Sinai, which that is supposed to be a picture of. I haven't seen any natural formation that looks anything like that anywhere in Israel or anywhere nearby, but it's a nice picture. So we refer to this as the standing at Mount Sinai, Ma'amad Har Sinai. The interesting thing about this is it is a public revelation. Most other faith traditions, I won't say all because I don't know them all, but most other faith traditions, whenever the revelation takes place, it takes place in private. God speaks to the prophet directly in private. Moses goes up the mountain and spends 40 days and 40 nights there, and God dictates to him, but everybody is there. There's no secrets that are specific for religious leadership. Okay, even when the priesthood is established later on in the Torah, it's written down for everybody to understand. And they're told, here's what the priests are, here's what they wear, here's who they are, here are their functions. And basically anybody can read that text. It's not specific to one group of people. So everything is done publicly. There's not this concept of secrecy or privilege granted to a particular group of people who are going to know stuff that nobody else does. Even true today with the learning of sacred text. I went to rabbinical school and I had to learn all this stuff, but you don't have to go to rabbinical school to do that. It's easier when you have a lot of teachers who know it already, but it's open to anybody to study and to learn. And what happens here is the establishment of a brit, of a covenant, of an agreement between two parties. In this case, it's an agreement between the people of Israel and God. So I want to emphasize this concept of brit, of covenant. There's an unfortunate, I say unfortunate, because I think it's caused more problems than it has provided clarity. There's an unfortunate historical tendency to refer to Judaism as the chosen people. Okay, I think that phrase has I think we have to get rid of it. Chosen in the sense of chosen for this specific covenant. Okay, when we hear the chosen people, the chosen one, right? We think Harry Potter, right? This is somehow they are elevated above everybody else. That's not at all what this concept of covenant means. If anything, it means that this people have been given responsibilities that nobody else has. Not that that makes them better, but in order to fulfill the requirements of this covenant, Jews are expected to do things that other peoples are not expected to do. Okay, so example, might be the dietary laws, right? Judaism has this rather complex system of dietary laws, although if you're vegetarian, it's really, really easy. I'm just saying. But we have this system of dietary laws, and Judaism has no expectation that other peoples are supposed to follow those as well. That is something that was part of our covenant, and that's something we're asked to observe. So chosen people, I would really like to get rid of that and replace it with covenanted people. We are a covenanted people, which doesn't make us unique either. Okay, so what does this idea of covenant come to teach us? Right, that's the question we're going to ask. This is the what are we doing here question. And our answer is that we have these commandments, mitzvot in Hebrew. There are 613 of them that traditionally that are counted throughout the 5 books of Moses that Jews are ostensibly obligated in. Now, a lot of those are what are called commandments of not doing, right? So don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery. We're fulfilling all of those commandments as we sit in this room. All right, so commandments of not doing are the easy commandments. Although not all of them are, right? Some things we have to restrain ourselves from are much more challenging. Okay, the dietary laws, right? Don't eat any animals that don't have a fully cloven hoof and chew their cud. Well, it just so happens that there are animals, so I'm told, who have a fully cloven hoof, who don't have a fully cloven hoof and don't chew their cud, who are absolutely delicious. Likewise, anything that comes out of the water, any aquatic animals, have to have fins and scales. Well, I'm told that lobster is really tasty too. Okay, so there is some of those negative commandments, so to speak, the thou shalt nots, do require some self-restraint. But nevertheless, that's what this covenant is all about, is what are the things that we have to do to fulfill our obligation on our end of it. All right? So I like to say that this covenanted relationship is unique but not exclusive. Okay? The best human example I can think of is a marriage, right? My relationship with my spouse is unique. It's exclusive in the sense that we only have that with each other. But that doesn't make our marriage better or worse than anybody else's marriage, right? Each of those relationships is unique in its own sense. So this is the way that Judaism really views other faith traditions, right? If there's enough people here of a certain age, I also refer to this as the tinker toy model. Okay, so it doesn't matter, and there's many, many, many more, right? But the question that I always like to ask is, so look at these variety of relationships that we have, which one of those is the correct one? Yeah, they all are, right? Each has their own path, each has their own way of going. My Taoist teacher in Chicago would say, the Taoists teach 10,000 paths, or 10,000 doors, one destination. He would also point out, however, that you can only walk through one door at a time. So, if you want to try and combine faith traditions and live in more than one of those outer circles at the same time, you can't. Because if you try and, no matter how close the doors are, right, even if the doors are right next to each other, if you try to walk through both of them at the same time, you get the door jammed right in the forehead. Can't get in. Okay, so you pick a path and you stay on that and you use that path. You may have to change paths, you may decide to change paths, that's fine. But each of those has their own unique value. All right, we're going on, I forgot I had the sound effects in there. We're going on to the third core concept, the concept of redemption. And this is the where are we going one, right? So we have to back up in the book of Exodus to the departure from Egypt. That is our paradigm for redemption. And what does that departure from Egypt come to teach us? It comes to teach us the definition of freedom, which is, physical emancipation, right? The Israelites were physically enslaved, so they had to have that burden removed from them. But there was also national independence. They became the people of Israel. after their liberation. That's when the Torah actually starts referring to them after the liberation from Egypt, and spiritual liberation. The reason it's given initially for that Moses tells Pharaoh to let the people go, to go 3 days into the wilderness so that they can have a festival to God. That was the original request. Okay, we kind of like, oh, Moses said, let my people go. But that's not what he said at first. At first he said, let my people go 3 days journey into the wilderness. We're going to have this festival. Okay, so freedom requires all of those. We also learn from this that individual salvation requires universal salvation, and likewise, universal salvation requires individual salvation. Okay, the poet who composed the poem, the New Colossus, which is on the base of the Statue of Liberty, also said, we are none of us free until all of us are free. So Judaism makes no distinction here between universal and individual salvation. They are one and the same. So I can't say I've been saved, too bad for you, because I'm not until you are. And this is this concept that I really love. We act and God reacts. So prayer in Judaism is I can have individual prayer, but the fixed liturgy is all in the plural. We say we. Okay. Even on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, when we are making confessionals, they are not individual confessionals. They're always in the plural. We have sinned. We have done wrong. We have done this. Even if it's stuff that you personally didn't do, because you are part of a community, you're part of a society. And if something is happening in a community or in a society, you can't just say, well, I didn't do it, so I have no responsibility whatsoever. Classic example of we act and God reacts, by the way. That's why I used this picture. I can't tell if that was supposed to have been a photo from the Ten Commandments or not. But the Israelites crossing the Reed Sea. It's the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea, by the way. Different body of water. And the Reed Sea no longer exists, in case you're wondering if you can find it on a map. No. Gone. Long gone. At the moments when the Israelites are caught between the Reed Sea and the approaching Egyptian army, and they've got, by the way, the pillar of fire spread out in front of them, protecting them. So they're in no immediate danger, they just have no place to go. And Moses utters this wonderful phrase, which is very much dramatized in the movie The Ten Commandments. God's gonna fight for you, watch. All right? What the movie doesn't include is my favorite line in the entire Hebrew Bible, which is God answering Moses and saying, I'm translating pretty literally here, why are you shouting at me? Speak to the children of Israel and go. In other words, if you do something, then I, God, will do something. But if you just stand there and say, don't worry, God's going to fix it for us, not going to happen. It's not the way it works. We can also sort of understand that this whole conundrum of Pharaoh's hardened heart. At the beginning of this whole dramatic story, before anything else happens, God says to Moses, oh, here's what's going to happen, right? You're going to go to Pharaoh and ask him to let the people go. I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Bad stuff is going to happen. Eventually, he's going to let you go. Okay? That's God being God and not being constrained by linear time, right? God knows time from beginning to end, all the dimensions. So God already knows how the story ends. So that's God doing sort of the Reader's Digest version of the rest of the narrative. Because Moses does go to Pharaoh, say, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. But the text is very specific. For the first 5 of the 10 plagues that are visited on the Egyptians for not releasing the Israelites, for the first 5 of the 10 plagues, the text actually says Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Pharaoh becomes stubborn. It's only 5 plagues in that the text shifts to this idea that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So, what do we learn from that? What we learn from that is we act and God reacts. Not that God made Pharaoh to be stubborn, but by the time Pharaoh had sort of dug himself in that deep, it was as if he couldn't stop himself anymore. Right? And we know that, right? The more habitual something becomes, the harder it is for us to undo it. And the easier it is for us to rationalize that what we're doing is okay. Because once you get that deep, right? And there's plenty of material in the field of psychology to back that up. Right? Once we get in deep enough, we're like, well, I can't get out now because then everybody will think I was wrong. I am wrong, but I don't want everybody to think that I was wrong. And then there's this whole idea that we are partners in creation. All right, the 6th day, when God finishes God's creation, labor of creation, it says that God finished all the creation, all the labor of creation, which God created to do. There is a dangling participle at the end of it, just as problematic in biblical Hebrew as it is in English. Okay, so what does to do mean? Who's going to do that? And according to our interpretive tradition, to do means us. We do. Now it's our responsibility. Creation, the work of creation is done. We are now the stewards of creation. We don't own it, remember, but we now have stewardship of it, and it becomes our responsibility to act first. Okay, so we're going to just briefly here have a word from our sacred texts. We say Hebrew Bible. We do not say New or Old Testament. We call it Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, the 5 books of Moses, which means instruction. Nevi'im, those are the Hebrew prophets, and Ketuvim, those are the sacred writings. Those are things like the Book of Psalms and Chronicles and things like that. So no, we do not say the Old Testament because for Judaism, there's just a testament. There's just the one. Okay. Testament is actually a word that comes to us in English, or in this context comes to us in English from the same concept, from the same idea as covenant. So when we say Old Testament and New Testament, that is a teaching of the early Christian church, which we refer to as supersessionism. In other words, because the Jews did not accept the messiahship and divinity of Jesus, they broke the covenants, according to early Christianity, and a new covenant was established with Christianity as the quote-unquote New Israel. So when we say Old Testament and New Testament, we are assuming that supersessionism is correct. And of course, for Judaism, that's not correct. We just have this continuing testament. The other thing is that the Christian scripture, as we would call it, or the Greek scripture, doesn't have any relevance to Judaism, because it's all stuff that happened after our Hebrew Bible was canonized. Okay, so the entire Hebrew Bible is the Tanakh. Then we have the sort of secondary text. This is the rabbinic texts, the primary rabbinic text. That is the Talmud, which comes from a root that means learning or teaching. See a pattern here, right? Torah means instruction, learning, teaching. Yeah. Come on. Hello. All right. It's made up of 2 portions. The Mishnah, which means repetition or study. Pattern continues. Keep pushing the wrong thing here. There we go. This is sometimes referred to as the oral Torah, or rabbinic law, the primary rabbinic law. Some of it may date to the 6th century BCE, and by the way, we say BCE and CE before the Common Era and Common Era, rather than BC and AD, which would be before Christ, and Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. our Lord, meaning that's Christianity speaking. So in Jewish settings and in academic settings, we use BCE and CE. Some of the material may be as old as the 6th century BCE. So what would that be, 2,700 years ago? The final redaction of the Mishnah wasn't until the year 220 of the Common Era. The language is Rabbinic Hebrew, which is different than the Hebrew, slightly different than the Hebrew of the Bible, which is biblical Hebrew. Okay, and along with the Mishnah, we get the Gemara, which means completion, or guess what, learning. And this is discussion and debate of the Mishnah. This is stuff that took place over centuries. And the Gemara is sealed. In other words, we don't add any more material around the 5th century of the Common Era. So the remarkable thing that happens with, and the language is Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, which is related to Hebrew, but is not exactly the same language. So if you go to rabbinical school like I did, and you want to study all these sacred texts in their original language like I did, you need to know biblical Hebrew, you need to know rabbinic Hebrew, you need to know Jewish Babylonian Aramaic, and you need to know medieval Hebrew as well, because the commentaries are all medieval Hebrew. So if you want to kind of unpack them in their original languages, you got to know a few old languages. But the remarkable thing about this is because some of the material in the Mishnah goes back to the 6th century BCE, and the last layers of the Talmud are over 1,000 years later. About 1,000 years later, you have generations that are talking to each other in the final edition of the text, the final editing of the text, who are talking to each other over centuries. So when there are quote-unquote debates in the Talmud, the one authority who takes one position and the one who takes the other position may not only may they not live in the same generation, they may not even live in the same century. All right, so I just wanted to show you, this is a page of the Talmud, the print version, okay? This part of it is, this is the Mishnah, okay? And then the slightly larger letters here, if you notice them, that's the beginning of the Gemara. That's the beginning of the commentary and discussion. All around the outside here, these are later commentaries. Those are medieval commentaries. Over here are when this was first done in, this is based on an edition from probably from the 18th, 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. Those are the prototypes of hyperlinks. These are references elsewhere in the Talmud where something that's going on here is happening. So if you have a full set of the Talmud, and the one that I have is 22 volumes, and you pull out this one, and it says, oh look, there's a similar discussion on a similar text in this other book, then you have to go drag that one off the shelf and flip through it. Yeah, it's all been digitized now, but there's just something about hauling out that big old book, right, paging through it. That's really wonderful. All right, meanwhile, back to our regularly scheduled program. We're finishing up on redemption. If we're going to talk about this, we've got to talk about the Messiah thing, right? Because that's really the dividing point between Christianity and Judaism. That's where that divergence happens in the 1st, 2nd century of the Common Era. So how does Judaism approach that? Well, first of all, not to be too smug about it, it was our idea to begin with, right? The word Messiah in English comes from the Hebrew word, the biblical Hebrew word Mashiach, which just means anointed. So who is the anointed? There were two individuals who were referred to as Mashiach, as the anointed one. One was the high priest, when he was installed in his office, and one was the Davidic line of Israelite kings, the rightful heir to the throne of David. When they were enthroned, they went through this anointing process, and literally anointing, oil, spices poured on their head. That was one of the ways that they were brought into their office. So we take this Hebrew word Mashiach. It works its way through Greek and through Latin, which don't have gutturals like ach, right? Don't have sh sounds. And by the time it makes its way to English, it's transformed into the word Messiah. Okay, Mashiach becomes Messiah. That's why it's double S's, by the way, because it used to be an SH. So, who is this person? The one that we're focusing on is a rightful heir to the throne of David. And in the book of, I think it's Matthew, that starts in the Christian scripture, not as familiar with that as I am with the Hebrew Bible. I believe it's the book of Matthew that starts with the family line of Jesus. And the family line of Jesus has to be traced all the way back to David and Jesse. Otherwise, the claim of kingship would be totally lost on the Jewish population in the 1st and 2nd century in Judea, right? This person's identity is unknown to us and to himself, and I'm using the masculine pronoun here because consistently there have been regnant kings of Israel, only one regnant queen of Israel, and that didn't work out very well at all in biblical times anyway. So in the course of the upheaval in Jewish history, the line of faith is that the descendants of David exist in every generation. We just don't know who it is, and they don't know who they are, because of all of the stuff that's happened. That has been lost. So that means that the rightful heir to the throne of David must be fully human. That person may be, when that identity emerges, they may be a very charismatic leader, but they're fully human, just like their ancestors were. And by the way, if you want to see absolute proof that the Hebrew Bible leaves the flaws and scales on even its most important characters, read the David stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel. He's not such a nice guy. He does a lot of kind of questionable, bad, creepy things because he's a human being. And he's a human being who has been raised up to a level of tremendous power. And as Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So we make it very, very clear, even in our sacred text, that even the most important people are fully human and make mistakes. Moses makes mistakes. Abraham makes mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. So since we don't know who they are and they don't know who they are, in order for us to know, for their identity to emerge, something has to change dramatically. Okay? So the world needs to be transformed. But remember that thing about we act and God reacts? We don't wait for God to change the world. Sorry, was it the John Mayer song, or Waiting for the World to Change? Not a Jewish song, even though his last name is Mayer, which makes you wonder if maybe he's got a Jewish background. But anyway, that's not it. We have to continue working to transform the world in order to see improvement. All right, and then finally, this is the really intriguing thing to me. In order for the identity of the descendant of David to be known in a future generation, that means there had to have been a rightful heir to the throne in every generation, including this one. So the Messiah, if you will, exists right here and now in our generation, in our time. We just don't know who they are, and they don't know who they are. So what would be what do we learn from that?
That anybody could be.
Bingo, right. So treat everybody as if they are the person who, if identified as such, would be the charismatic leader who would work with us in the transformation of the world. Right? Anybody could be. All right. I'm going to jump through this real quick so we have some time for questions and such. It's a popular statement that Judaism has no dogma. One of my favorite, by the way, interfaith jokes is a Buddhist steps up to a Christian and says, "I'm really sorry, my karma ran over your dogma." But, never mind. Okay. I liked it. And my Buddhist friend liked it. So that's what matters. But the closest we have is something that was put together by this guy, a very, very important figure towering figure, really, in Jewish medieval history. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, better known by his acronym Rambam, and perhaps even better known by his Greek philosopher named Maimonides. He born in Spain in the early 12th century, dies in Fostat, which is now Cairo, in 1204. And the tradition says, from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. In other words, from our teacher Moses in the Bible to Moses Maimonides, there was no one to compare in between there. Okay, so he puts together this thing, which he calls the 13 Principles of Faith. Okay, and number 12 out of 13 is about the Messiah. And he says to believe that in truth he will come, and when he says come, he means the identity will emerge, and that you should wait for him even though he delays. So this is gives us the text of a song that Jews sing at the Passover Seder and have been singing for centuries. That I believe with a perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, and even though he may delay, nevertheless, I still believe. Okay. However, he warns us, Maimonides says, you should not calculate time for him to come, or look in the verses of Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, to see when he should come. There is no king of Israel except from the house of David, and from the seed of Solomon alone. Okay, so not only the descendant of David, but David to Solomon and down, right? Because biblically in Samuel and Kings, that's the deal that God makes with David and Solomon. Interesting, you should not calculate time for him to come, or look for verses of Tanakh to see when he should come. In other words, don't worry about when or how it might happen sometime in the future. Focus on now and doing the work that you need to do to transform the world as it is into what the world could be. That's as close as we get to it. And then very quickly, this is I like this graphic. This is a wheel that gives us the cycle of Jewish holidays in the course of the year. We are right about here. We're in a leap year on the Jewish calendar, so that's what this extra 13th wedge is. The Jewish calendar is a modified lunar calendar. Okay, so every cycle of the moon, every new moon is the beginning of a new month in Judaism. The problem is that a lunar year, 12 lunar cycles, is 11 days shorter than the solar year of 365 days, which means that every 3 years, the lunar year ends a month earlier than the solar year and keeps sliding backwards until it comes all the way back around again. Islam uses a pure lunar calendar. The beginning, the first day of Ramadan, the month of Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan in Islam, is 11 days earlier every year until it comes all the way back from where it started. Okay, right now, this year, Ramadan begins on the 11th of March, sunset of the 11th of March. Okay, but last year it began around sunset around the 22nd of March, and then the year before that, it started at sunset like the 3rd of April. Okay, so in order to fix that, because our sacred text says that Passover, which is here, in the month we call Nisan, it's also in the Torah, it's called the month of Aviv, the spring month. Passover always has to be in the spring lunar cycle. So every 2 or 3 years, on the Jewish calendar, we add an extra lunar cycle, a 13th lunar cycle, so that we keep adjusting it so that Passover always falls in the spring. Okay. Confused? Yes, it's very confusing, which is why every year we just get a calendar.
You Google it.
Or you Google it. But yeah. And by the way, the primary source in Jewish households for getting a Jewish calendar every year, believe it or not, is your local Jewish funeral home. They usually provide them for free to the community, and when you stop to think about it, that's A, good marketing, and B, really, really creepy. Right? Hi, we're your local funeral home. Here's the calendar. Start checking them off. All right. Where are we at? Okay, I'm just going to do this really, really quickly, just this. There are two unique, probably identifying practices of Judaism. One is kashrut, the dietary laws, we talked about that. The other is Shabbat, the Sabbath. And the Hebrew word Shabbat is where we get the English word Sabbath, by the way. Same deal as with Messiah and Mashiach, right? When you take Shabbat and you move it through various other languages and it lands in English, it becomes Sabbath. Observing a Sabbath as an actual day of rest from just before sunset on Friday until after it gets dark on Saturday. That's the way we count days. As an actual day of rest, Judaism may be among the last faith traditions, general faith traditions, to maintain their Sabbath as an actual day of rest. A Muslim friend pointed that out to me years ago, by the way. She said, we don't have one, really. And Christianity has Sunday, but Sunday you go to church in the morning, depending on your denomination, but for most denominations, you go to church in the morning, or if you're in one of the black churches, maybe you go to church for a good chunk of the day. But later on, before the day is over, you can do something. You're doing something else, right? So that's sort of a unique aspect of Judaism. All right, I'm gonna back off of those because we're running short of time, and I don't. Oops. There we go. Okay, I want to open the floor for questions.
I have-
Yes.
And maybe I missed it in the talking. The Messiah
Yeah.
can be anybody,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, and in the Jewish tradition, we're all supposed to do good.
Right.
How are we going to know who the Messiah really is and when he actually comes?
So it's a great question. How are we going to know who the Messiah is, and if it's time? There's been a lot of false alarms, even within the Jewish community. I mean, setting aside the first century and the split of Christianity from the Jewish world, there have been a number of false messiahs over time. Because people have done exactly what Maimonides says you shouldn't do. Don't look for the signs, right? There are rabbinic texts that say, here are some things that are going to happen just before, before the world is transformed, right? Basically what those texts say is, things are going to get worse before they get better, which is fairly typical, right? And that's how you tell a story anyway, right? You need dramatic tension, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, and all of a sudden, boom, resolution, right? We're not supposed to do that. We're just supposed to do the work of making the world a better place. We will know when we know. It'll be clear. And it won't happen, we don't have to even think about that, until we ourselves have done the work of transformation. So since we're a long way away from that, we can rest assured that not anytime soon. Or it might be, if somehow humanity and humanity gets its act together and says, "Gee, this is really bad. We should do something different." So far, not a lot of indications of that. Other questions? Really? Yeah, go ahead.
So, in the Garden of Eden, so you're saying just the fact that they ate from the tree, that was the sin, right?
That was disobedience.
Okay.
There are a lot of layers to that story that we don't learn in Sunday school. One of them is, and that's a question that our tradition asks. And being an interpretive tradition, you get more than one interpretation, right? There's the wonderful moment in Fiddler on the Roof where somebody says something and Tevye says, "You're right." And this guy says the opposite thing and Tevye says, "You're right." And someone asks Tevye, "He's right and he's right, they can't both be right." And Tevye says, "You know what? You're also right." Okay? So there's an old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. It's not a joke. And it's really something very, very positive, because if you have multiple interpretations, then you can adapt to changing times, which has been a secret, by the way. Still a secret, not really, of Jewish survival under incredible oppression, is that Jews and Judaism have been able to adapt and to say, okay, this has been taken away from us. What else do we have in our sacred text so we can adapt, adopt, improve, and persist and still maintain the connection? Okay, so the interpretation that I'm drawn to with the Garden of Eden is not so much what Eve did or what Adam did, because once God calls them out on it, right? Adam's immediate response was, "She made me do it. She gave it to me," right? And Eve's immediate response was, "It was a serpent. Serpent made me do it," right? The important lesson in that event for me is in the dialogue between the serpent and Eve. The serpent says to Eve, "So what did God tell you about this?" And she said, "Well, we can have anything in the garden, but not from the trees in the center of the garden." Well, she's overgeneralized there, because there's two trees in the center of the garden. One they're supposed to eat, the other one they're not supposed to, right? And she says, we're not supposed to eat it, and we're not even supposed to touch it, or we'll die. Well, earlier in the text, God says nothing about touching the tree. It just says, don't eat from that one tree. So Eve has already expanded on the prohibition. And the serpent exploits that and says, you're not going to die. Which implies to me that basically the serpent goes, look. Touching the tree, nothing's happening. Go ahead, you touch the tree. Oh yeah, you touch the tree, nothing happened. You're fine. So go ahead and eat it. Because you said, don't touch, don't eat. But that wasn't the original prohibition. What I learned from that is, this has been the nature of human beings from the very beginning. One, that we make bad choices. But backing up from that to that whole bit about Eve expanding on it, is we tend to over-dramatize and to exaggerate and to make the negatives bigger than they really are, right? And that's what is the catalyst that results in the primordial human beings losing this perfect idyllic place for them to live. So what does that come to teach us? If we want to get back to an idyllic place to live, then we have certain things to overcome. One is making impulsive choices, right? So impulse control, very, very important. And anybody who's worked with young children, like that's the function, that's the focus, is helping them deal with impulse control. A lot of adults too, for that matter. But the other thing is, keeping perspective. We like things to be more dramatic than they really are, right? So when we tell a story, it tends to be a little more embellished than it really was. Because we don't want to sound like it's too boring. We have another example of that, by the way, when Moses is up on the mountain and the Israelites are building the molten calf. And when they come back down, Moses confronts his brother Aaron, who was supposed to be in charge, right, taking care of the people, and says to Aaron, "Why did you let the people run wild like this?" And Aaron's response is, I don't know what happened. In the original text, while the thing's going on, the description of it, Aaron is the one who says to the people who are, we're going to build ourselves a god. He goes, "Oh, tell you what. We'll have a festival for the God of Israel tomorrow." All right, tries to put him off, but they still want something. So he's the one who says, "Give me all your gold," figuring that they're not going to give him all his gold, all their gold, but they do. And he's like, "Oh boy, so I better do something with this." So he throws it in the pot, and he takes the graving tool and forms the actual thing, right? When he's confronted with it, what does he say? The people were getting crazy, so I said, give me your gold, and they did, which was a surprise. So I threw it into the cauldron, and this calf came out. Which wasn't a lie, but he left out the important part, right? He embellished the truth. Yeah.
So you said that the Torah is like a set of instructions, but that you don't take it literally? Not like some people do with the Bible and take it literally, word for word. So it can change from generation to generation. In terms of
Interpretation is based on context. So it's not like you can interpret away, don't murder, and then say, well, in some cases murdering is fine. Don't commit adultery. It's like, well, you committed adultery, but there were extenuating circumstances. Not that way interpreting, but how do you apply that in real life? So in a situation, I'll give you a historic example. In the Hebrew Bible, identity goes through the father, right? So if a non-Israelite woman married an Israelite man, all the children were Israelites. For a number of centuries now, Jewish identity goes through the mother. If you have a Jewish mother, you're Jewish, even if you have a non-Jewish father. If you have a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, your status isn't Jewish, and you have to sort of fix that, right? So originally it was patrilineal, until Judaism found itself in a circumstance where in medieval Europe, where landowners asserted baronial rights. In other words, a young woman was about to be married, and as the landowner, he could have her taken, and he could have sex with her first, because he was the landowner and she was just there. Plus, she was a Jew; she wasn't a Christian, so she had no rights anyway. Okay, so what did Judaism do? How did they adapt? They said, yeah, we know we had all that stuff in the Bible, but we're going to shift to matrilineal descent. So it doesn't matter who the father is, because there was a lot of situations where it was questionable if her new husband was the father or not. So we're just going to make that all go away by saying, if the woman's Jewish, the baby's Jewish. And so it doesn't matter what else is done. All right. So that's more of an example of how we adapted something which was well established, but in the context of the reality in which Judaism was living, we stuck with it. And at least in the conservative movement, we've stuck with that all the way down to today, because no need to change it. All right. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Next month is on, I can't remember the day. I'll look real quick. Why don't I have it? That's interesting. There it is. It's on March 11th, and the presentation will be on Buddhism, and our presenter will be Dr. Claudia Schippert, who until recently was a professor at the University of Central Florida. She is now the executive director of the American Academy of Religion, and a just fine human being. So please do join us then, and if you can leave behind your evaluation if you have a chance to fill it out, much obliged. Thank you.